Hello everyone, my name is Ray Johnston and I'll be the facilitator for this evening's panel event, First Nations Climate Justice. A little bit about me, I'm a STEM journalist for TV and radio and podcasts and online. I was the first science and technology editor for NITV at SBS, and I'm the producer and host of tech and science focused podcasts, Queens of the Drone Age, Here and Beyond and Take It Black. Now, the world's first technologists are the sovereign First Nations peoples of this continent, with knowledge passed down since time began, despite all the attempts to erase it. And as a Wiradjuri woman who was born and raised on Darug and Gundungurra country, I am honoured to be living and working today on the unceded land of the Darug people. And I pay my deepest respects to Darug elders, past and present, and I extend that respect to any of my First Nations aunties and uncles, brothers and sisters that are joining us today. And I ask that you too watching acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land that you're on today. Now, I'm so excited to be facilitating tonight's panel discussion with three fantastic contributors. This event is supported by the Emergency Leaders for Climate Action and the Climate Council. And after tonight, those organisations will be collating the discussions into a written summary, which will be available online for anyone who couldn't make the event or anyone who just wants to do some further reading, catch up on everything that happened. So thank you to all of our attendees as well who submitted questions in advance. We're going to do our very best to work through as many of those as possible tonight. There were quite a few. Please feel free to continue the discussion in the chat function on your screen. Now, our facilitators from the Climate Council will try to answer any questions that you have. And whenever a panelist mentions an organisation, they'll also post a link there for you to explore further. Now, without further ado, I would like to introduce our three panelists for this evening. Firstly, Mibu Fisher is a saltwater scientist with engagement skills for strengthening partnerships between First Nations communities and the research sector. Her specific interests are around traditional knowledge, science, and management practices being considered with modern day fisheries, coastal and conservation management. Now, she joined with other Indigenous and traditional practitioners to strengthen the global Indigenous voice and leadership in areas of marine research and coastal Indigenous livelihoods. Now, her goal is to bridge a gap that draws attention to the Indigenous communities facing the front line of impacts and changes to coastlines, ecosystems, and livelihoods from climate change impacts. So welcome, Mibu. Firstly, who's your mob, where you're from, and then can you give us a sense of what your work looks like in practice? How are you exploring how traditional knowledge and modern day fisheries and coastal management can combine?
Hi Ray, I'm so excited to be here tonight. So I'm Mibu Fisher and I'm a Nunakal, Nugi and Gurrumpul woman from Quandamooka country, which is off the coast of Brisbane and also some of the mainland. And tonight I'm joining you from Nipaluna, which is Hobart, down in Nutrewita on the lands of the millennia people. So I'd like to pay my respects to the elders past and present and thank them for allowing me to become part of their community. So that's a big question for me to try and answer. So it's a little bit more tricky because I do a lot of more theoretical type work. So a lot of what I've been doing is around setting up research opportunities in the right way and also advising other marine scientists and researchers to start to think about engaging and working with communities through a co-design process. It's really because I believe it's really important for First Nations communities to be a part of the process and not just to have a seat at the table, but for the researchers and practitioners in the marine space to be prepared to go and sit on the beach or under the tree and have those genuine connections and relationships with community members. So that's kind of what I'm doing. Most recently, I am one of the Indigenous authors for the Marine and Coast chapter for the Australian State of the Environment Report 2021, which is the first time there's been Indigenous authors as part of this process. So often when you're the first, it's a really slow process, but it's really exciting. And also I'm doing some oral history projects down here in Nutrewita with the Palawa Pakana elders around their cultural practice of shell necklace making. They've noticed some changes to the shell thickness and abundance, so we're using traditional knowledge to create a baseline study on that. So, that's me.
Doing some incredible work. We're very lucky to have you here with us tonight. Thank you. Now, next up, we have Bhiamie Williamson, who's a research associate and PhD candidate at the Centre for Aboriginal Economic Policy Research, Australian National University. He graduated from ANU and in 2017 from the Masters of Indigenous Governance at the University of Victoria, British Columbia, Canada. He also holds graduate certificates in Indigenous Governance from the Native Nations Institute at the University of Arizona and the Indigenous Trauma and Recovery Practice from the University of Wollongong. Now, Bhiamie's expertise includes cultural land management, cultural burning with a focus on southern temperate Australia, and the impacts of disasters on Indigenous peoples. So welcome, Bhiamie. Who's your mob? Where are you from? And I know that you'll speak further about the findings of some of your work around last season's bushfires later, but could you give us a sense of how your research intersects with extreme weather events and climate change?
Yeah, thanks so much, Ray. It's such a pleasure to be here on this panel tonight. So I'm a Bhiamie Williamson. I'm a Euahlayi man, so my mob come from northwest New South Wales and we go up into the southern part of Queensland as well. And my mother comes from Cloncurry and her family go up into the Gulf of Carpentaria, up into northwest Queensland. I'm really excited to be on this panel. And I think before I respond directly to that question, Ray, I think it's worth acknowledging the fact that I am the only male on this panel. And I think that evidence is something that we very much know, that Aboriginal women are, very really key leaders in our community. They've held our communities together for so long. And I think tonight's panel evidences that is not changing. In fact, it's just strengthening again. So, just like to acknowledge that, all the wonderful women who share this panel with, and it's wonderful to to get that opportunity. But
you know how to get on our good side right away, don't you?
Yeah, raised by the right mother, don't worry. But to respond to the question directly, a lot of my work and research over the last little while has been focusing on cultural burning. So I've got a bit of a background in cultural burning as a one-time practitioner, as a researcher, and as a sort of a policy maker in the space as well, and recently an advocate. And so kind of come at cultural burning from a number of different perspectives. And I'm really interested in how cultural burning can be used as a land management tool to mitigate against the catastrophic risks associated in particular with bushfires, with catastrophic bushfires in Australia. And also the other part of the work that I think is really relevant for this conversation is Indigenous peoples in disaster recovery. So really understanding what are the true impacts of climate change driven catastrophic disasters on Indigenous peoples, and really understanding that, bringing their voices and their experiences, their needs and their desires in those times to the fore. So I'll leave it there and look forward to the discussion.
Thanks so much for joining us. Looking forward to hearing everything you have to say tonight. Now, finally, we have Tish King. Tish is the community organiser at SEED Indigenous Youth Climate Network and Our Islands, Our Home campaign. Now, during her studies in ocean science on the Gold Coast, Tish became really passionate and actively involved with grassroots environmental groups and rallies across Australia and also overseas. Now, she's got experience across different industries at CSIRO, Oceans and Atmosphere, and the exploration and minerals industry. So she brings a diverse perspective of First Nations and environmental justice. Now, Indigenous peoples are on the front lines from the impacts and causes of climate change. So Tish believes that working towards a sustainable and just future for First Nations people is a fundamental step towards solving the climate crisis. And I tend to agree. So welcome, Tish. Firstly, who's your mob, where you're from, and could you tell us a little bit more about SEED and the work that you do there?
Hey, Dudley Mob, Kappa Kubul. Good evening. So my name is Tish, and I am a proud Torres Strait Island woman with strong blood connections to Masig on my mum's side and Badu Island on my father's side. And before I begin, I would like to acknowledge country, knowing that we are all tuning in from different area codes. Where I am, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of Kulin Nation and would like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, acknowledging that I am a guest here on their country and that sovereignty was never ceded. I'd also like to pay my respects to my brother and sisters here today on the panel. So deadly to be here. And I'd just like to acknowledge every Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander person that identifies Indigenous to their homelands or people of colour that are tuning in. So I am the community organiser at SEED Indigenous Youth Climate Network, and often and commonly referred to as SEED Mob. And we are Australia's first and only Indigenous youth-led climate network. And since 2014, we've been building a movement of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander young people to protect their land, rivers and oceans from the causes and impacts of climate change. And so for those who are tuning in and aren't too familiar with our national campaign, SEED Mob work with traditional custodians and their communities to protect their country from fossil fuel companies like Origin Energy from the harmful impacts of fracking in the Northern Territory. Because right now, 51% of the NT is covered in exploration licenses for oil and gas. And if all went ahead, much of the Aboriginal-owned lands would have country polluted by the shale gas industry. And the NT is connected to one of the water tables where if it is polluted by dangerous fracking processes, all of our water is poisoned for those communities in the NT. And water is life for our mob. Like our deserts, springs and our bushlands are way too precious to risk, these dangerous fracking wells. And so, we have seen how it affects our health impacts, our culture. And, we've seen that firsthand from our brothers and sisters all the way on Turtle Island over in North America, and how that, this industry is just risky business because, we acknowledge that communities have a right to, have a final say about what happens on their country and to make decisions about their own lives. And it's only when communities have the freedom to define their own path can our people truly heal. Native title law in this country is a little bit broken, and it is not strong enough to protect, country from mining companies and our greedy politicians who can't take no for an answer. So, together we must strengthen our land rights and put community before profits. And so as the NT is one of the sunniest places on earth, right now remote communities rely on those diesel generators, and we need to shift that. We need to become more energy and self-sufficient and supply clean and cheap power to our mob. And so here at Seed Mob, we advocate for climate justice now because we are experiencing these impacts now.
Fantastic. Thanks for all your work on that, Tish. It's really appreciated. You're doing so much. Now, Mibu, your work focuses on marine ecosystems and coastal communities. What are some of the ways that climate change impacts coastal First Nations people?
Yeah, well, I guess when we most of us, when we think of climate change, we kind of get that image of the ice caps melting and the glaciers coming off and the polar bear balancing on the iceberg, and how that influences people can be quite difficult to understand. We think of sea level rise, and I might leave that for Tish to talk about. But then we think of things like ocean acidification, which is ocean acidification, reduces the ability for carbonate to be available in the ocean. And so various species really require carbonate to produce structures. So think of things like shells and crustaceans. And without their ability to get that within their environment, they become vulnerable because they're unable to produce their exoskeletons. So we have things like ocean acidification impacting on species. Then we have ocean warming. So ocean warming is starting around the equator, and we're starting to see, because as our oceans warm, it's pushing the ocean warmth polewards, so to the north and the south, and it's starting to actually create species redistributions. So we're seeing species from the tropical warmer waters move poleward, and this is starting to also impact on other ecosystems and species abundance. And what people are seeing, it's impacting on seasonal indicators, cultural species like the mariner shells down here in Tasmania. And so it's really just changing everything about what a lot of First Nations communities know. I have some colleagues and friends who are in Greenland, and the winter they just had, they were noticing that it was supposed to be negative 30 degrees and it was 30 degrees during the day. And this actually was creating water to be flowing. So the smaller species were migrating earlier, which then impacted on the larger species because then they followed them. And then when their fishing season opened up, there were no species in their waters that they were able to fish for. So not only did it impact them from their subsistence fishing and their ability to get food sources, it also impacted on their economic livelihood. So I think, climate change impacts coastal communities in a myriad of ways, like most of us. But yeah, it's not just the food sources, resources, culture, and connections to country. When we look at it in that broader sense, particularly from a Western perspective, we really can identify that the changes to the physical environment for First Nations people globally also impacts our ability to contribute to our economy. It impacts our well-being and our health, particularly our mental health. And so it's really just adding an additional obstacle to already marginalised communities. And it's just really sad to see. We've already been through so much with colonisation, and to have this climate change impacts just adding to that pressure, it's really sad.
Yeah, it's absolutely devastating. Tish, how have you seen it impacting on home in the Torres Strait?
Wow, really can resonate with a lot that Mibu has just said, because Well, I mean, before I just share a little bit about my own personal experiences, I actually importantly want to state that while I am a proud Torres Strait Islander from Kulkalgal Nation, I'm a mainland Torres Strait Islander and want to acknowledge those people, families, and communities that are on the front lines of those impacts. That they have their own lived experiences. But to really paint you a picture, I do, on my mum's side, I come from Masig, so York Island in English, which is, one of the unique islands that make up Kulkalgal Nation, which is a group of these low-lying islands surrounded by these beautiful coral caves. Now, some of you may have remembered the TV show that aired on SBS Ran, Remote Area Nurse, back a decade ago, which was actually filmed on Masig. But for those who actually haven't seen it or, not in that generation, it is picturesque and a teardrop-shaped island with these white coral sandy beaches and these like transparent turquoise waters. Think Maldives cross Bahamas, so dreamy. And so, mentioning, I guess, what Mabu said, as global warming is increasing, we are seeing our oceans rise. And as our oceans are rising, these low-lying islands like Masig are seeing king tides erode meters of our island homes. And as I went up north at the end of 2020, over the summer, I went to visit my big brother, Yese Mosby, one of the claimants of the Torres Strait 8. And I so emotional, but I had to pick up the bones of my elders because erosion is damaging our burial sites. And as First Nations people, we know that, these are our spirits of our old people, and it's a sign of disrespect. It's desecrating, who they are. And it's, it really, it's that heart quenching, pain in your chest, right? And, we are seeing our ecosystem shift exactly as maybe said, as our oceans are warming. And, this is the future of our food security is at risk, effectively impacting the way we hunt and practice our cultural traditional ways. So, and, not just that, our natural weather events are becoming more frequent and more aggressive, that my people are now finding it hard, and I'm sure maybe your communities too, are finding it hard to identify those seasonal cues. And all the while, here we are in 2021, still continuing to adapt to the uncertainty and bipolar COVID landscape. And, there is my people and our island communities are at risk at becoming refugees in our own country.
How does your work with Our Islands, Our Home, how does that campaign, tie in? What work are you doing there?
Thank you for the opportunity to actually share a little bit about it, because, we did actually launch, halfway through last year, just a bit of a digital storytelling to share our stories. But, as sort of maybe just mentioned about her friends and colleagues over in Greenland, all around the world, First Nations people, Indigenous people, and people from marginalised groups are on the front lines of the climate crisis. But for people of Zenadth, the traditional name for the Torres Strait Islands, again, like king tides, erosion, inundation, coral bleaching are threatening the homes and our culture, while the Australian government refuses to address the climate crisis. And urgent action is needed to ensure that they can remain on their islands and for the continuation and survival of our culture. So Our Islands, Our Home is a campaign led by 8 incredible Torres Strait claimants to protect their homes, and have brought a human rights complaint against the Australian federal government to the Human Rights Committee of the United Nations over the government's inaction on the climate crisis. And, these demands that they want from the Australian government is to, fund adaptation programs that will allow Zenadth communities to adapt to climate impacts, commit to going 100% renewable in Australia in the next 10 years, supporting our communities to build community-owned renewable energy, and transition away from these fossil fuels as rapidly as possible through a transition for workers. And, we need to push the world to increase that global ambition and keep warming less than 1.5 degrees.
Good case you make there, that's for sure. Now, Bhiamie, your work is focusing on the impacts of bushfires on Aboriginal people, and not just any bushfires, but the major ones, like ones that we saw in 2019, 2020 over that summer period. And what have you found during your research?
Yeah, so our research was really focused on the 2019-20 Black Summer bushfires, as they're now known. And at the time that it was unfolding, it was just kind of we knew that it was hitting in areas that had really high populations of Aboriginal people, right along the eastern seaboard in particular. And so some colleagues and I at the university, we kind of put our collective heads together and we started to map those the demographic distribution of communities affected by those fires. And what we found is that in New South Wales, Victoria, the ACT and Jervis Bay Territory, over the 4 jurisdictions, just background, in those 4 jurisdictions, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people make up 2.4% of the population. In areas directly impacted by fires, they made up 4.8. So Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people were twice as likely to be impacted by those bushfires in particular. But the demographics sort of only tell one part of the story as well, because another part of what was unfolding that wasn't being captured was the incredible impact that those kind of events have on people who are from that place, people who care for that country, people who associate with that country, including certain parts of that country, like landscapes, plants, animals, seasons, waterways, all of these things that had just been absolutely smashed because of the fires. No one was really talking about how those fires and events like that impact Aboriginal people in a way that is different to non-Indigenous people. And so we started to sort of unpack, some of the things that we knew that would impact people. So things like, people, as I said, that associate with kind of totemic plants and animal species, like what happens when those totemic plant and animal species are wiped out of the landscape and don't return? What does that mean for the cultural continuity of the community? And even sort of more, for non-Indigenous people, even sort of the more tangible stuff for them, like thinking about things like native title, things like proving land rights and connection to country. So, but like proving connection to country is a big part of the native title regime, right? And one of the key evidence that people can use to demonstrate their ongoing connection is cultural heritage sites. And so what are the long-term impacts for things like native title cases and people's legal recognition if those sites are wiped out? People aren't really asking those questions. People aren't understanding those stories. And so that's kind of where our research came in and started to highlight that. But conversely, focusing on Aboriginal communities alone was incomplete, because what we also examined were previous royal commissions and independent inquiries. So we looked at a few of those, things like the McLeod inquiry post-2003 Canberra bushfires, the Royal Commission into the Black Saturday bushfires in Victoria. And there's other work that's been done that looked at recommendations coming from a lot of those post-disaster, post-bushfire inquiries. And what we found was just astonishing. That is, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people were not there at all, nowhere. The only references to Aboriginal people in the Black Saturday Royal Commission, which was just so comprehensive in its scope, the only real reference to Aboriginal people was in some kind of reference to the past and how the landscape evolved over time and the existence of Aboriginal people in these landscapes before Europeans came. And so, we just kind of found that people who were disproportionately impacted in numbers, who were deeply impacted in their cultural ways from these events, and then just the sheer willful ignorance of them as existing in the world today, and as of needing to be understood, needing to be listened to, needing to be engaged. It was pretty astonishing, really. There's no other way to say it.
Yeah, I think we're all going to have to do a bit of deep breathing and wiggling our fingers and toes during this panel, because there's been a lot of, obviously ongoing trauma, but recent trauma as well that we're experiencing as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in this country, and with the impacts of climate change and with the impacts of those recent bushfires. I was out. My family grew up. I grew up, my family are from the edge of where the Wattle Creek fire was. So that big fireball that came through, that was like 100 meters from my parents' place, and I spent weeks out there with them fighting those fires and just trying to create a pocket of country where the animals and birds and everything could go. And yeah, there's a lot of trauma that you carry from being there and from the knowledge of knowing what was lost in that place, and to not see that reflected in any of those royal commissions, in any of those recommendations. I remember one of the recommendations being, maybe we could listen to Aboriginal people, and it's like, are you kidding me? But yeah, we'll do some stretches, we'll do some breathing. I want to know from each of you what climate justice means to you, because it is the topic of today's panel discussion, and it can mean different things to different people. And I will throw back to you, Bhiamie. What does climate justice mean to you?
Yeah, sure. So climate justice, I suppose in its most simplistic term, it's a simple acknowledgement that the people who are and are going to be most impacted by climate change are the people who have had least to do with producing the problem. We've heard Tish already sort of talk about the impacts of climate change on in the Torres Strait, and that's unfortunately only going to get worse. When you think of people, communities of people, societies of people who have produced climate change as a problem, I'm sorry, Torres Strait Islanders have absolutely nothing to do with that. And even out here, like with our mob. So my mob, my mob are from northwest New South Wales, and so if you've got a map of like the northern basin in the Murray-Darling and put your finger right in the middle of the northern basin, that's where our people are. So we are totally dependent on waterways. We are totally dependent on the river systems, and unfortunately, obviously, it's been really mismanaged for decades out here now. But added to that, the real threat, the significant threat is, increasing drought out here. Fortunately, we've had a good rainy season, but people out here speak even now about how lucky they are to have rainfall, have good rainfall. Like, how depressing is it that a natural environmental cycle is something that we should be grateful for now and feel lucky for? It's just not the way it's meant to be, but we're going to be impacted by it. We are being impacted. We will continue to be. So I think, coming back to climate justice, it's just really clearly understanding that climate change is unjust. The impacts of climate change are unjust. If we can understand and come to the realization that climate change is an unjust process and it will disproportionately affect, people in southern, the southern hemisphere, people who are black, people who are brown, people who look like us on this panel, we can really open up a serious conversation about what we need to do as a society, as a country, as a very wealthy, very well-off country, what we need to do to support the people who really need the support.
Mubu, how about you? What does climate justice mean to you? Bit deep.
Very, very deep. I think for me, climate justice is linked with self-determination and the ability for communities and Indigenous people to make decisions for themselves and to have resources available to make those decisions, because it's just so unfair at the moment. It's a pretty simple answer for me in saying that, but that's really just how I feel. Yeah, it comes down to that for me.
Yeah, absolutely. And how about you, Tish? Climate justice, what does it mean to you?
Really hearing what both, brother and sissy there just saying is that really echoing exactly what they say. Like, I can't really reiterate that, but, there are so many, First Nations people out there advocating in their communities. And, while I can't speak for them, I know that for the campaigns that I am privileged to support, it actually it comes back to, white Australia acknowledging the dark history and colonial impacts, of this nation. And then, that the systems that cause genocide on this country are the same systems that continue to oppress us today. And we need to acknowledge, the communities have a right to have a final say about what happens on their country. Exactly what Sissy Mibu said, that self-determination, we should have that option. You know, we should make our own decisions because they are our own lives. And it is only when communities really have the freedom to define their own path, can we really truly heal from that. And, you know, and it's about, I guess, you know, having that just sustainable transition for all, because it is our collective future. You know, we have a responsibility to ensure a future for our children and their children so that we can continue to survive. I think it's sort of important what, you know, Bella there, Bhiamie, just saying about, you know, the research that his team does is that, you know, people don't understand how that affects us and people, you know, when country is hurting, they're hurting because we are so deeply connected to this land, to our islands, that, you know, our bloodlines run deep into that. And it's about changing and shifting the narrative and, you know, changing people's hearts and minds and showing them that and sharing them that. And so, you know, we need to stand in solidarity with each other and not only have our own people leading this space, but have a seat at the table in this decision-making process.
Absolutely. Now, you know, we've said it here, you know, we didn't create these problems, but we are working to fix them. And I want to talk a little bit about some of the solutions being led by communities. Now, Bhiamie, your research, you know, touches on cultural burning to better prepare for bushfires, among other things. And there have been a lot more discussions. I've lost count of how many articles I've written about cultural burning since those horrific bushfires recently. Have you seen anything actually change in practice, though?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And Ray, I think it's first worth pointing out that like a lot of the media attention is obviously focusing on cultural burning, and that media attention is really welcome. But we can't just talk about cultural burning at the expense of other cultural land management and water management practices. I mean, cultural burning is fantastic, and it's something that Aboriginal people have done so well for so long, and it's great to see them start getting recognition for that. But, you know, to think about it practically, like, you know, there might be 2 months in a year when you're able to put fire into the landscape. But that leaves 10 months of the year where people aren't sort of just sitting around kind of, you know, streaming Netflix and playing the PlayStation. It's, you know, what happens in those other 10 months is just as important. And indeed, cultural burning, the success of burning relies on effective management over those other 10 months as well. So we really need to be having holistic conversations around cultural land management practices and specifically cultural burning. But in terms of a change in practice, I'd say that the change in practice actually hasn't been within Aboriginal communities ourselves. I think it's been with non-Indigenous people. I think the fires have really woken people up. I don't know, it's kind of, it's strange and depressing that it takes an event like the Black Summer bushfires to really wake people out of their slumber, but it really did jolt people. People are looking for new solutions, people looking for new management strategies, and they're kind of, you know, finally acknowledging the contributions that Aboriginal people have always made and want to make as well in the management of our homeland. So I'd say the biggest change that I've seen is a real openness and willingness to engage, and I think this panel evidences that even further. Openness and willingness to engage with voices of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, the management of our homelands, and you know what, like we'll walk through any door that opens to us, because, you know, we all share a deep kind of yearning to continue to care for our country and be connected and to look after those places. So yeah, the biggest change I'd say is actually with non-Indigenous people, not us.
Mibu, based on your experience, how can policymakers go about including traditional knowledge into both the design and the implementation of policies for mitigating and adapting to climate change?
Yeah. So I always like to say the first thing on the outset has to be complete respect for traditional knowledge and knowledge holders. It might seem quite obvious, but I think a lot of people in this space may not exactly have that respect automatically there, which is quite disappointing. And I think a lot of people, when they get the opportunity to be in the room with knowledge holders, are challenged, and because they're challenged, they don't understand what's going on, and they just kind of go in for the kill, like, that's wrong, what you're saying doesn't make sense, it's not real, all these things. But really people need to start checking themselves and start trying to sit back and work out, why am I uncomfortable with this? Why is my view being challenged? Because it's just a different worldview and it's not wrong. And so that's kind of the first hurdle that I think needs to be changed. It's a slow process because it's institutional change and systemic barriers that need to come down, which is always a slow process, and it's really hard work. And it feels like, you know, you can have all the right conversations and get all the yeses, and you might only move a millimetre in the right direction. So yeah, in terms of having those conversations, it's persistent conversations and not taking no for an answer, and putting yourself out there in positions where you are going to be seen as the troublemaker and the annoying person that people don't exactly want to have a conversation with. But I think it's really an important thing for people in these positions to understand, because Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and Indigenous people around the world, you know, we lead a very sustainable way of life. And when we talk about the future and have these conversations in regards to areas of growth, that word sustainability is often right there alongside it. And, you know, it's really about focusing on changing those perceptions of what traditional knowledge is and how it can add to sustainability, and using the right, like, buzzwords around the right people to get their attention to change. And I've been learning to do that, particularly within my organisation. So yeah, it's interesting. But I just think it's really important to continue to have those conversations with whoever you can have them with, so that they can start to see, and by they I mean people in Western science, can start to legitimately see the Indigenous worldview as equal. And I feel like it's only then, you know, together the two different worldviews can actually create a way forward for us. I think that's really important to try and get home and implement. We're not trying to take over the Western science system. They need to work together, and it's all about respect and knowledge and taking that time out and challenging your own viewpoint.
Yeah, it's complementary. And isn't that part of science anyway, being open to new information and changing your view as a result of it? Come on, people. Tish, through your work with SEED, you must meet so many people who are seeing the impacts of climate change and want action. So what are some of the demands that you hear across your networks? What do people want?
Yeah. You know what? Like, it's been a deadly, which means like very deadly, that I'm just here having this yarn because it's so great. Like, bringing like traditional, you know, knowledge and Western science together. Like, I feel just so inspired. And anyway, I just wanted to say that. But look, being with SEED, it's allowed to connect and make relationships with mob all across our country, and diverse country, and learn a lot from them, and, you know, about how, you know, their cultural practices on their country and, you know, in their communities. And so, you know, again, really not being able to, you know, speak for all the amazing work that is happening across this nation. You know, it comes back to education and knowledge and sharing our stories, because we need to, it's back how, like, we are from this land, and, you know, it's like trying to shift their perspective of seeing that. And I think that's what I love hearing about the work that, you know, Bola and Sissy are doing, because, you know, they're trying to sort of like, it's so great that we have that representation in that sort of like Western science space. You know, I think, you know, for me personally, it is just about, you know, shifting the narrative, because, you know, looking in the last year that we have had here and all across the world, Australians love being outside. They love being in nature. You go on their Tinder or Bumble profiles, they're all like, nature lover, And so it's like, great, you love nature, so do we, and we come from here. So you should be advocating just as much as us, because you get that same feeling that we've had for our whole lives. You get it that minute that you're out there in the ocean, on your surfboard, hiking, snowboarding down a mountain, And so it's like, again, sharing our stories and our old spirit stories too, about how that mountain was carved out, how our rivers were formed through our, totems. And I think the more education that we can share and normalize our culture more, they are able to understand as well. We're now in a new generation, or where we can be proud, Black and deadly, and we can speak up for it, and, respecting, that history that came from us, in this country. That's the part of that education. And so, standing in solidarity, and it's together, that advocacy, not just for First Nations people, for our allies and for non-Indigenous people.
Now, Bhiamie, I'll throw to you now. Now, you spoke before about the impacts of the bushfires. Where are those communities at now? Has there been recovery since the fires? Are there preparations in place for increased fire activity? What's the future going to look like in those areas?
Yeah, thanks, Ray. And I do want to say, before answering this question, that I encourage people to really turn to the communities that were directly affected, if they really want to understand the first-hand experiences, if they want to hear the stories of traditional owners in those areas, if they want to hear stories of, how Aboriginal people kind of really supported themselves when no one else would support them. They're the stories that only them people can tell. And so I'd encourage everyone to make space for that, to be open for it, and to seek them stories out, because they are out there. In terms of the, the places and communities and people that I work with throughout, right throughout the disaster affected areas, recovery is have the communities recovered? No. I think it's just, there is just a deep and unending sadness that lingers in those places, and may do for the rest of our lives. I think that while people have come to terms with the destruction that was caused, they haven't come to terms with the extent of their trauma and their grief. And people really need help with that. And people are angry. People are just so angry. But it's not anger that, certainly the Aboriginal communities that I work with, it's not anger that's kind of crippling. It's anger that's kind of motivating. People are hungry to get out and start looking after those landscapes again. People are already talking about when's the right time to put fire back into those landscapes. People are talking about what trees they need to plant, what native plants they need to propagate. What animals they want to bring back. People are talking about all of these solutions. They don't need help, but they need support. And looking after the land and recuperating it and helping the land to recover is such an important part of the healing process. So it's kind of community recovery and the recovery of the natural environment down there for us. They're the same thing. And that's where we really need to be supporting local communities who know what they want to do. They just need the resources and the support to be able to do it.
One of the questions that came up again and again to be asked on this panel was, how do I be a good ally? How do I support those communities? What do I need to do? So I'd love to hear from you as to what you see people can help with and how they can do that. Mubu, I'll go to you.
So I think allies are really important in creating a platform and a safe space for our voices to be heard, for our wants and needs to get out there into the general public sphere. I think being a good ally is making that platform, but also being quiet once you've made it, and making that space for Indigenous voices to come through, and to really convince as many people who are like you to help people who are like us, because it's easier for them to hear it from you, unfortunately, than it is to hear it from us. And I'm not quite sure of the psychology behind that, but it just seems like it's easier for people to connect with someone who gets it, who is like them. And yeah, creating that space, safe space, platform, and particularly in terms of researchers, you need to think about putting funding aside in your projects for engagement, to remunerate people for their knowledge, to remunerate them for their time, to build relationships. It's not free. You need to be genuine, and for that to happen, there needs to be money attached to it. Yeah.
Now, we have covered some heavy stuff tonight, so I'll finish up by asking for some hope for the future. Do we have some? Tish, I'll go to you first.
What a tricky question.
Yeah, it is, isn't it? It is.
Look, yeah, a really tricky question, because a lot can change in a small period of time or a long period of time. And, looking at our current landscape at the moment, our national leaders are using public money right now to fund companies like Origin, Zenadth, Empire Energy, to frack country, that, will, exacerbate our emissions that will affect First Nations people, not just here, but our brothers and sisters in the Pacific, and all across the world. And it's like, those impacts are not directly, but indirectly. And so that's concerning, and it's really deeply hurts me. And but I am hopeful, because there is change and there is advocacy, and not just the environmental movement, because people think that climate justice is just in the environment, but it's also through education, it's through health, it's through art, and there is a massive shift, and I love that. And so I do have a vision for the future where systems of injustice are torn down and, are sustainable, and community-led solutions can rise up to their place, that there will be effective policy and systemic change, and it is required. And here, not just in our country, but, we must have, our own people, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people must have that seat at the table. It must be place-based. It must be deliberative and culturally safe, like Mibu said. Our involvement must be sincere. And in order to achieve real First Nations justice, I think we need to be able to lead that space. And this extends, to respecting our sacred sites and ensuring more First Nations voices to Parliament. It means, reconciliation. It means treaty. And so I think, with all the people out there doing lots, I do see I do see hope. That gives me hope. That gives me mana, love, energy. It empowers me. It inspires me. And so that's one thing that I will say, that, to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, we have strength and resilience. And I've never seen it so much ever in my life. And I just have so much respect for all of us. But yeah, anyone else want to add to that?
I want to live in your future, sis. Put it that way. Bhiamie, how about you? Are you hopeful for the future?
Yeah, hope's a strange word.
It is, isn't it?
It is, yeah. It's a word, yeah. Like, these questions kind of often get asked, and no matter how many times I get asked it, it's never any easier to kind of answer. Like, I feel like hopeful about what our future holds, being on this panel, listening to to our amazing speakers, and just working with community, working the strength of community, developing those relationships, and really letting the lives of community members and people that we work with and our own family members enrich us and kind of sustain us, and that really kind of keeps us going. So really hopeful about that kind of stuff. But then conversely, I just feel, I don't know, just like a bit kind of hopeless about a lot of things as well. Like to roll the last question that you asked me as well, about sort of, being a good ally. Like, we've got a lot of really good allies that we work closely with, and yet we kind of seem to still struggle to get allyship in the really big institutions in this country. For anyone that wants to see what we're talking about, like, just think about the last year and a half and the incredible interest in cultural land management and cultural burning in this country, and yet the Bushfires and Natural Hazards CRC, and I'm sure many people watching this would know exactly who that organisation is, and the fact that they're moving to become a brand new permanent institute. They've released, like, just last month, a research portfolio, framing a disaster research portfolio that will set up natural hazards research over the next decade. And you can just have a look at it, and it's just, we're nowhere in there, nothing, absolutely nothing. And you think, how could this be? How can it be that we've had such interest and that all of these doors have opened and these are the conversations we're having, and yet we are still left out? It is just extraordinary. And my mind just explodes that this continues to happen. It's just not good enough. We shouldn't be fighting for space anymore. We should just be enriching the lives and the livelihoods of people in this country, all who enjoy it and who live here and who call it home and who care about it now. So it's, and it's not, I don't know, it's, yeah, so it's kind of like two different ships, going at different speeds and heading in different directions with this stuff. It's just, you don't really know, where it's heading. I think our communities are our greatest strength, and we need to keep going. And sort of, it's whether or not, I suppose, to be honest, whilst I'm hopeful, I don't feel confident things will change. I don't feel confident that this country gets it, and I don't feel confident that we are still being taken seriously. But even though I don't have that confidence, even though I can't see it changing, it does not mean that me or colleagues that I work with will stop doing it at all. So, we're kind of, in the fight, not going anywhere. And it's really up to non-Indigenous people to really pick up this fight and walk this walk with us.
Well said. And now I want to pass over to Greg Mullins, AO, AFSM, the former Commissioner of Fire and Rescue New South Wales and the convener of the Emergency Leaders for Climate Action. Greg has joined us as an audience member tonight, and he wants to share ELCA's gratitude for the discussion. Over to you, Greg. You're on mute, Greg. Yeah, it had to happen. It had to happen at least once.
Yeah. Look, I think it's about time people like me kept quiet and listened anyway. And, hearing this tonight, look, I'm coming to you from Gumaragal land in Sydney, paying my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us in the audience tonight and this incredible panel. Look, emergency leaders for climate action, it's 33 former fire and emergency service chiefs who tried to speak up about climate before the fires and during the fires. And what I heard tonight was just pretty upsetting, to be honest. I heard about the sorrow, the sadness, the anger about totem animals being wiped out, the landscape that, country that people are so connected to. And I heard about the willful ignorance of institutions, royal commissions. Ask Indigenous people who've been here for 5,000 years. And, we've made a right mess in just 200, my mob. So, look, what came through to me is we just have to listen. And right at the end, is there hope? And I hear you, Bhiamie. It needs people to walk with our Indigenous brothers and sisters people like me, who have been in charge of these institutions and might be able to get some ears to finally listen. And I hear what you say about the natural hazard CRC. I'm going to be on the phone tomorrow. Trust me, I didn't know about that. But we need to work together. And it took a tragedy that people like me had no idea how to deal with to open up these ears around the nation. Let's build on that. And with the energy people like you bring to it and the passion, I think we can do this. So look, the emergency leaders, we thought it was time to listen, not to talk at you and tell you how it is, because you've had a couple of 100 years of that. We're listening and we want to walk with you. So thank you so much, everybody. This has been incredible.
Thanks so much, Greg, and thank you to all of our panellists tonight. We have touched on some pretty heavy stuff, so everyone look after yourselves. Make sure that you have a nice cuppa after this, maybe a hot shower, a bit of stretching to kind of shake it all off and relax a little bit and get back into it, into the fight again tomorrow. Looking forward to hearing how that phone call goes as well, Greg. To our audience, please take the time to follow and learn more about everyone's work that they're doing. It's so important, and everyone needs to be aware of all of the difficult and hard work that's being done by people like our panellists tonight. Tell your friends, tell everyone that you know. You can find a bunch of helpful links in the chat as well. Keep your eyes peeled for the upcoming written summary of tonight's discussion as well, with suggestions for additional resources. Again, Mundunguru, thank you for joining us and for listening, and good night. Thank you.